The other night I was driving in the centre lane of a 3-lane city street. All of a sudden a car comes into my right blind spot and almost slams into me. I look over and it's swerving in and out of the lane, braking abruptly. I honk and I look over to see if the driver is possibly distracted. Then I see that the man driving is drinking something out of a brown bottle. The man then comes up to my side and is screaming at the top of his lungs. Not wanting to get involved, I make a lane change to the far left lane to get away from the man. I can still hear him screaming, so I turn on my rear view camera and I see the man swerve across 2 lanes to get behind me. He then starts speeding up as if he's trying to ram into me from behind. Once I see him inches from my bumper, I decide to run the red light I am stopped at and make a right turn in front of the 2 lanes of traffic beside me in the hopes that at this point he would just leave me alone. I look at my rear view camera once again and I see that this man was following me and trying to hit me from behind yet again. I panic and speed off onto a side street, but when I look back I see he's not going to let up. He is swerving in and out of the lanes behind me and is trying to keep up. In the distance I see a freeway on-ramp, so I speed over in hope of losing him on the freeway. The on-ramp has 2 lanes that merge into one. I pass up on one car prior to the merge, thinking that that car will create a buffer between me and the man chasing me. When I look back into my camera, I see that the man is driving along the shoulder on the brush to the side of the on-ramp in order to pass by the other cars and catch up to me. At this point I am driving close to 100 miles per hour, scared for my life, so I slow down and dial 911. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and she recommends that I try to get somewhere to safety. The man then catches up to me and begins coming up to the side of me on the freeway. He repeatedly tries to swerve into me, as if to ram me or run me off the road. I slow down in hopes that he will pass me up, but he too slows down and his wife in the passenger seat throws a bottle at my car. For a second I lose visibility as the car is covered in a brown foamy fluid. I think to myself, surely this is the extent of his road rage. I look over and it seems as if he is continuing on the freeway. Ready to get away, I then pull off onto the next freeway exit, thinking I can just leave this insane situation. As I do this, the man sees me and makes a 4-lane change onto the exit ramp and tries to ram me once again at the freeway exit. I am then forced to speed through the city streets when I finally end up at a red light, trapped next to this man. I look over at the man and I roll down my window. He is screaming at me. "Why the fuck did you honk at me, you bitch? Are you trying to make me look like a bad father in front of my kids? You wanna go, bitch? You fucking little bitch." His wife is also yelling at me. "Why would you honk at him in front of my kids?" I look into the back seat and I see 2 children in car seats. Since I am on speaker with the dispatcher, she hears all of this and tells me just to try and get away. At this point I am done. I just want to get away from him. So I make a U-turn to head back on the freeway. He follows me once again and almost hits a plastic construction lane barrier. He then follows me again and is trying to hit me from behind. Once I get onto the overpass to get onto the freeway, I glance at him to the side of me and I see that he is holding something up in my direction. Suddenly, I hear a very loud bang. In that moment, the dispatcher on the phone screams, "Did he shoot you? Are you okay?" Thinking I've been shot, I start screaming, "He's shooting at me! He's shooting at me! He's going to kill me!" Realizing that running away isn't working, I stop and the man speeds off. Luckily, there is no broken glass and I am not injured in any way. The dispatcher tells me to pull off to a nearby safe location, so I go to the parking lot of a nearby mall. I tell the dispatcher the make, colour and model of car as well as a partial license plate. The whole time I drive there, I am concerned that the man could be following me again, but they send an officer immediately over to file a police report. In waiting for the officer, I realise that my car's cameras are always recording, so I hit the save button. The officer comes over and I tell him my story, describing everything in detail. I also tell him that I may also have footage of the whole thing. We take a walk around my car and for the most part there is no damage. The officer then informs me that because I'm not injured and because there is no damage to the car, there really isn't anything that can be done. I ask him if this was assault. He says because the bottle hit my car and not me, it is not assault. I ask him if it's reckless driving. He says that here in California, that a misdemeanor requires the presence of a CHP officer to convict. I then ask him if it could be considered an attempted murder because he was trying to ram into me. But he says that this is just plain old road rage and there's not much that can be done. At most, the officer says that once he has a complete license plate, an officer can go out and talk to him. I ask him if the potential footage could be helpful in getting this man reprimanded in some way, and he tells me to only send me the highlights and necessary screenshots, though he doesn't think anything can be done. At the end of all this, I am extremely shaken up. I eventually go home and review the footage captured by my car. Luckily, I have the entire thing recorded. The moment he almost hits me, his wife throwing the bottle at me, his face as he's yelling at me, his license plate, and even him trying to ram me. It's all recorded. A few days later, the officer calls me and confirms the license plate I have in the video with a recording he has from the freeway on and off ramps. A week and a half has passed and there has been no update. While I understand the law is the law, it is unacceptable to me that this man could be so overtly aggressive on the road, threatening my life, the lives of his children, and the lives of everyone else on the road with no sort of punishment. I was genuinely scared for my life, and in the process both he and I endangered the others on the road. Ultimately, this has left me feeling very disappointed with the system. An act of violence was committed, and due to technicalities the other driver gets off. I am trying to keep my retelling as factual as possible, but this was a really terrifying experience. Even in the past few days, I still feel a bit hesitant to be an aggressive driver, overtaking people, changing lanes, etc., and I'm not comfortable honking. I really wish I could say this didn't get to me, but it has. One odd detail is that the man was taking pictures of my car before the bang happened. What would he possibly want that for? Has anyone else been in a situation like this? Is there truly nothing that can be done? Any recommendations for how I can at least have someone check on those kids? Like I said, I have full footage of everything. This happened over 10 years ago. Not many people in my life know this because I find it pretty embarrassing on my part, but the more I think about it, the crazier it seems. I will change the names of the people involved for the sake of anonymity. In July 2008, I was 15 and a very late bloomer in terms of socialization and normal milestones that one would have at this age. I had friends, but they often teased me, and my closest friend at the time was a huge manipulator. I had extremely low self-esteem, and looking back, it's clear I was depressed. This is not directly relevant to the catfishing experience, but perhaps part of the explanation as to why I got so easily caught up in it. I was playing a game online, and since I was already addicted to the computer, this game just made things worse. You could talk to a lot of people on this game as well, and many regulars would come on and we'd all chat together. I had made some friends on there that I really enjoyed talking to, and I guess it was a break from my bleak life at the time. One day these two guys popped up in the game. Let's call them Ryan and Michael. They were both 17 years old. We started chatting and it was good. Ryan and Michael knew each other in real life and I got really close with them, particularly with Ryan. Not only did I get close with Ryan, but so did another girl who would play the game and regularly chat to people. After a few months, Ryan started showing a romantic interest in me, and I likewise was attracted to him. We had each other on MySpace and his account was extremely legitimate looking, with all these pictures and comments from his friends. I found him very attractive as well. I even found myself getting jealous over how often he would speak to the other girl from the game, our mutual friend. But as long as Ryan kept paying attention to me, I felt validated and good. I had never had any real romantic experiences in my life before this, if you even want to call it that, so I was excited. My parents found the whole thing extremely weird, especially since they hated the idea of me being on the computer so much in the first place, so online friends didn't sound too good to them. Things started to get sexual between Ryan and I, and he would always say how badly he wanted to take my virginity. We even used to talk on the phone, and I loved his voice. It was deep, but not too deep, like there was still a teenage boy there, and I felt like I was experiencing this completely romanticized first love. Yeah, pretty sad. Not only that, He lived in the US and I was in Canada, so it was all very unrealistic. Neither of us went on webcam because I wasn't too fond of how I looked, so going on camera would have been too much for me, and obviously Ryan never suggested doing it. I would send him pictures sometimes, but nothing sexual. Just personalised pictures he would want, and I started to feel confident from all the compliments he gave me. I spoke with our mutual friend, the girl, let's call her Jessie, about how much I liked him. I found out that she liked him too, which I was pretty mad about. What was even more interesting was that she told me how she kept trying to get him on webcam, but he never would. I didn't think much of it. After a few more months of weird drama between our E-trio, myself, Ryan and Jessie, I had a conversation with Michael. Michael and Ryan were in the middle of a fight, and Michael told me everything out of spite. The truth is, they were both girls. Michael was really Maddie, and Ryan was Jacqueline. I was so shocked by all of it. I confronted Jacqueline, who at first denied it, but then gave in as I said the guy's name of who she had used in all her photos, and who I believed I was talking to all this time. Maddie, aka Michael, told me his name. Apparently Jacqueline made this entire cyber world using this guy's photos she went to school with, and she created a pile of fake MySpace accounts with all of his friends. I'm not lying when I say this account looked real. You might also be wondering about the voice. I think Jacqueline just has a deep voice that was passable for a guy, especially one that is 17 years old. I wonder how many other people Jacqueline fooled with this MySpace account and persona. I tried speaking to Jessie about the ordeal, but she wouldn't believe me. She said that his MySpace was too legit. We stopped talking after a while, Jessie and I, but I'm sure she put the pieces together eventually. Jacqueline tried to keep in contact with me, but it was super weird. The funny thing is that I still have Maddie on all social media platforms, because we got on really great, despite the whole lying about her identity thing. I don't think Jacqueline and Maddie speak anymore. So Jacqueline, aka Ryan, let's never meet again. When I was around 4 or 5 years old, I lived in an area where everyone pretty much knew each other, if not personally, then at least by sight. There were loads of kids who all played together. This was when kids all played outside. We had big games going on like rounders and hide and seek, etc. There was a man who used to give local kids organ lessons in a caravan that was always kept parked in the car park that was around 3 houses down from mine and his own. One day I knocked on the caravan door knowing a friend of mine was inside, but the man, who we will call Mr. M, wouldn't let me in. He seemed to not want to let me in at all, making excuses such as "there's too many in here already," or "I'm too busy just now," etc. This particular day I was feeling upset already, and this made me feel really left out, so I went home crying to my mum, who told me to forget about it and gave me some sweets to make me feel better. Fast forward maybe a month or two to one particular night. I was in bed maybe around 9 p.m. when I heard people screaming and shouting outside my bedroom window. My window was at the back of the house, which faced onto Mr. M's front door. I looked out, and what I can only describe as a small mob, consisting of my adult neighbours, were coming out of my back door and starting to surround Mr. M's front door. Now, being a small kid, I had absolutely no concept of what was actually going on, but in retrospect it was pretty much the torches and pitchforks scenario. I saw my dad running towards the car park, and that's the last real memory of that night. The next day I came downstairs to find 2 people, which I came to learn were CID, in my living room. They ask if it's okay to ask me some questions, and proceed to tell me I'm not in any trouble. I began to cry, as police to me always meant bad things, due to my father's considerable amount of arrests, which I had unfortunately previously witnessed. They asked me about Mr. M and if I had ever been in his caravan, which, as I said above, I hadn't. They continued to ask if he had ever touched me inappropriately, or had said anything inappropriate, etc., etc. Nothing, thankfully, had ever happened to me. The neighbour kids weren't so lucky. Mr. M had been abusing kids in his caravan under the guise of giving organ lessons, and generally being the neighbourhood nice old man, who always had time and a kind word for the children. He had previously been in prison for the same charges, and his wife had stood by him. Upon release, the authorities had moved him and his family, wife, one adult son, 2 teenage daughters and a grandson, into my neighbourhood. An area which was a 2-minute walk from a primary school, ages 4 to 10 and 11, and was populated almost entirely with families and young children. There was an unconfirmed rumour that his daughter's child was fathered by him. His entire family knew what was happening and did nothing about it. His daughters I can understand, as they were abused and were teenagers themselves. But his adult son and wife? I still can't wrap my head around their silence, especially knowing he had done it before. Their silence is tantamount to condoning it, in my opinion. When I saw my dad running out that night, he had spotted the adult son sneaking out the back door of their house, trying to escape in his car. My dad smashed his car window, assaulted him, and was subsequently arrested and spent 6 months in prison. That night the family were escorted under police protection to what I assume was a safe house. Mr. M had been arrested previously that night. He'd abused over 10 kids. It's been a long time since I've spoken to my mum about this, so I'm unsure of the exact number, as it all happened around 25 years ago. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. I have no knowledge of what happened to him or his family afterwards, but I know that he would have served only 4 to 5 years max, as LTP prisoners in my country serve 3/4 of their sentences. My father had a reputation as a very scary and intimidating man, who was a known criminal with violent tendencies. My mum maintains that that's the reason I was spared the same fate as my friends. I do not condone my father's violence or the way he chose to live his life, but I do believe it saved me in this instance, as anyone who knew my dad and his reputation would know if he found out I did suffer any abuse at the hands of this man, he would hunt Mr. M and every member of his family that knew what he was doing down and murder them without a second thought, and be sure that everyone knew that he had done it. I'm thankful every day that 4 or 5-year-old me never entered that caravan, and I'm eternally sorry for my friends who endured what they did. Mr. M and my family, I sincerely hope we never meet again, and karma really does exist. This cautionary tale dates back to the mid-90s. Cell phones were still a luxury in those dark times, so I didn't have one. I was still an angsty teenager and in a bit of a mood. I didn't feel like talking to people and so neglected to arrange a ride home from a late school event. I was delayed getting out of the play, and by that time most of my friends had already gone home. I didn't have my own car and my mum worked late, so she wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. My only choice for a ride was my very recent ex, and taking me home would have made her drive in the wrong direction anyway. I decided that the best option was to walk home, even though it would take an hour, and it was already after dark. The route was one long, hilly road. It connected several quiet suburban subdivisions of houses, and the road was adequately bathed in the orange sodium glow of streetlights, so I didn't feel concerned for my safety. I had a large backpack full of books and gym clothes that I was taking home to wash. The bag was bulky and awkward, but not very heavy, and I was confident that I could walk the route without too much trouble. I usually walked home after school anyway. About a third of the way on my trek, some guy on a bike started to pedal past me. He was a much older guy, seeming to be in his late 30s, but obviously trying to dress down and look younger. He wore a long gold chain around his neck, a fact emphasized by his shirt, which was unbuttoned all the way. He kept swerving through the empty street, doing rapid figure eights and eventually popping a wheelie. He stopped next to me and asked, "What do you think about that?" Well, I'm the quiet, contemplative type, and not usually impressed by sudden bursts of ostentatiousness, so I didn't think much of his display. Honestly, my only thought about it was that this guy was kind of stupid for doing those things without a helmet. Trying to be polite, I said, it was pretty good, I guess." "Yeah. I'm Mike. What's your name?" This was a much younger, more naive version of myself. For the sake of the story, we'll call me Henry, because it rhymes and that's important for later, as you will discover. "I'm Henry," I replied. Mike proceeds to circle around the street on his bike so he doesn't outpace me. Are you running away from home, Henry? I realised that this was a valid question given the huge overstuffed bag on my back, the late hour, and the fact that I was probably walking around with a scowl on my face. No, I'm just walking home from a school event. I realised that there was a weird, hopeful tone to his voice when he'd originally asked. Mike continues to circle around me, and I'm slightly grateful when he wheels away because he smells like sour beer and BO. Like I said, I wasn't in the mood to deal with people that night, so if he wasn't talking to me, I tried not to engage him. Henry. He kept trying to engage me in conversation. Henry, do you like swimming? Unfortunately, we had drifted into a darker patch of road, so he couldn't see my patented annoyed eyebrow arching. Sometimes, I huffed, non-committally, trying to let the annoyance colour my voice. Henry. He drawled at me with each loop he pulled up next to me. After 3 or 4 revolutions, I snapped. What? Do you know the trailer park at the top of the next hill, Henry? I did, and grunted an affirmative. They don't lock their pool gate. Do you like hot tubs? Finally, younger, stupider me is picking up on his instincts and cluing into the fact that this guy is a huge creeper. I try to deflect the question. Sorry, man, I don't have a swimsuit. He responds, You don't need one. He did another slow rotation in his figure 8, saying my name in a long, eerie time to his bicycle's loops, and when I failed to respond, he followed it up with, You running away from home? Again, his voice was strangely optimistic when he asked. Starting to get severely unnerved by this guy, I blurted out, I'm going home. There was a slight wobble in my voice. My cool had definitely not been kept. He asked again if I wanted to go sit in the hot tub. I tried to keep him in my peripheral vision, but avoid eye contact, and I refrained from answering any more of his questions. I also tried to reach up and loosen my backpack straps in case I had to drop the pack and take off running. He continued circling back and forth in the road to stay at my walking pace and droning that long, gravely incantation that made me dread the sound of my own name. Henry. Henry. Punctuated by an occasional short bark of, Henry. Suddenly the safe suburban subdivisions looked a lot further back from the road. More of them were gated than I remembered. This continued for another half an hour. I considered turning down a side street, but the gated fortresses had only receded to shallow cul-de-sacs, and I didn't want to get cornered down one of them. The entire time he continued to chant, Henry. Henry. Don't you want to talk to me? Are you running away from home? Finally, we reached the top of the hill with the fabled trailer park and hot tub. He cut his current slow circle short and darted across to reach the street to the pool and managed to cut right in front of me so that he nearly hit me with his bike. You want to try the hot tub, Henry? Henry. 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 No! I screamed. I do not! Fortunately, he actually accepted the rejection for once and started his slow bike ride down the side street, calling back to me. Think about it and come back. You can stay in my trailer if you want. I just ran the rest of the way home, cutting across several neighbours' lawns and looking over my shoulder most of the time. So late night bike guy, let's not meet again, especially not near a hot tub. I posted on here a couple of days back with one of my less scary memories, so I thought I'd up the ante. So I'll post in order of severity, starting with my last post. I take you to a town called Shepperton, Middlesex. A nothing sort of little town, maybe even a village. I'm not sure, as I was 6 when I was living there, so wasn't really interested in finding out what qualifies as a town or village. My mum had left my horrible dad a couple of years previously. She'd finally gathered the strength to leave him after her BFF said that if she didn't, he would probably end up killing her. This is a story for another time. I digress. We were living on the top floor of a little 2-bedroom council flat. It was a lovely little flat, and my room was huge. We had 2 balconies, one from the kitchen facing out front and one from the living room facing out the back. My mum has never been lucky in life and has had to work really hard to support us, as my dad didn't give us any financial support whatsoever. She and I were 2 peas in a pod. We used to have pig-out picnics sometimes, and we would bring a duvet into the living room, sit on it and stuff our faces with junk food. I loved those nights. You'd get kids raving about going to theme parks or having a lavish day out, but honestly I would never have traded those times for anything like that. Anyway, my mum started seeing someone called David. He was an average build, dark hair and dark eyes. I always felt creeped out by him, but never let on, as this was Mum's boyfriend and he made her happy. The more he was around though, the more creeped out he made me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or the way he spoke. I can't quite put my finger on it. There was just something off about him. He started asking me to kiss him whenever saying goodnight and goodbye, a new level of uncomfortable. If I'd refuse, he would grab me and kiss me anyway, and he wouldn't stop even if I started to cry. He would only do this when Mum wasn't around though. He used to watch me when Mum had to go to work in the evening. She did many jobs and DJ'd quite often, so it meant lots of late nights. One particular night when David was looking after me, Mum put me to bed before she'd left, and I fell asleep soon after. Later on I was woken up by David. I couldn't tell the time, so I'm not sure when exactly, but it was late and dark. He dragged me into the front room and made me watch some film with him. It was Tommyknockers. I can still remember it to this day. A scene from the film where someone was sitting on a bed tapping their feet together saying Tommyknockers. This film was really scary and he forced me to watch it. I couldn't sleep for weeks. He told Mum I must have watched it from the landing without him knowing. Enter having bad dreams and the need for a nightlight. One night a few weeks later I was so scared I didn't want Mum to leave my side, so she took me into her bed and stayed with me until I fell asleep. The next thing I remember is being woken up by my mum crying and shaking me in a panic. "Joe, we need to go now," she said. In a dazed state and not sure if I was dreaming, I asked what I should wear. I could then hear David shouting and smashing up the living room. A few more seconds went by, my mum had dressed me and we were running out of the flat. She said, "Come on, as fast as you can, and don't look back." I kept asking what was going on. She told me not to worry and said we just needed to go. I kept looking ahead and running with my mum towards the main high street part of Shepperton. I was getting tired and all of a sudden my mum grabbed me and threw me behind a garden wall. We crouched down as she had her arms around me. I asked again what was going on. She shushed me and told me I needed to be quiet. She whispered to me that David had gone mad and we needed to stay away from him. We stayed there crouched in hiding. Eventually I saw David run past us and I literally couldn't breathe. I saw a large kitchen knife in his hand and he was wearing a black jacket. He was shouting our names and was threatening to kill us. His voice acted as some kind of sonar and we heard him getting further away. My mum peeked and checked if the coast was clear. Then she said we needed to run back to our flat as fast as we could and not look back. I trusted my mum implicitly, so off we went. We ran as fast as our legs would carry us. David eventually spotted us and gave chase. I don't think I took a breath. It was all such a blur. We eventually managed to get to our flat and Mum bolted the door shut. She jammed stuff against the front door as he started banging and shouting to let him in. Mum was shaking. He'd cut the phone lines and there were no mobiles back then. She made a fort by the front door, then he eventually gave up and went away from view. We slept by the front door all night so we could be alerted if he tried to get in again. Luckily we lived on the top floor so there was no other way in. I still don't know the full story as we don't talk about it, but I haven't seen him again since that night. I don't know what he would have done if he caught up with us. I don't want to know, and I for sure don't want to meet him again. I'm 19 and a female. I went to the movie theatre alone 2 days ago because I had nobody to go with, and right away I knew something was wrong. When I got there, a man was sitting in the seat that I had paid $16 to reserve. I didn't want to confront him about it, so I just sat a few seats away from him. During the trailers, he looked at me for a few minutes, and when I couldn't ignore him anymore, I looked at him to see what he wanted. He put his hand out towards me and said, "Hey." I don't know why, but I shook his hand because I have issues saying no to people. I'm working on it, especially after this incident. He asked me so many personal questions, the very first one being, "Are you here alone?" After that question, I should have known he was a creep. I told him yes because I panicked and I didn't know what else to say. Then he asked me what my name was, what college I went to, and why I was here alone. I answered everything truthfully because I just couldn't think of anything else. I was frozen. Then he asked me if I wanted a beer. I'm 19 and I actually look pretty young, so he had to have known I was underage. I said no because I've heard so many horror stories of men drugging women, and I just didn't want to be under the influence around strangers like him. When he left to go buy his beer at the concession stand, I moved away from my seat and sat in another row. I hoped he would get the hint and leave me alone. When he came back though, he looked for me, spotted me, and then sat right next to me. I was frozen again and completely terrified. The theatre was fairly empty and there were only 3 other people in there. The movie had started by this point, but he just kept talking to me. He kept whispering to me because I guess he didn't want the other people to shush him or tell him to shut the fuck up. I was too scared to get up and move because I didn't know how he would react. Would he hold my arm down? Would he try to trap me? Would he get violent? I just didn't know. Then he did something so gross that I haven't been able to forget it. He leaned his body towards me and whispered into my ear, "Hey, don't make it weird. Let's hold hands." He hovered his hands over my lap and watched me until I shook my head no. I got up and he asked, "Where are you going?" I told him I was going to the bathroom. Once out of his sight, I ran away into the bathroom where I had a panic attack. I realized now that it was stupid of me for telling him where I went because he could have followed me there and trapped me somehow. I've learnt that lesson. I spent 15 minutes inside panicking about what had just happened and what I was going to do about it. I was too scared to leave the bathroom stall because I didn't know if he was outside waiting for me. I was worried no one would help me because technically he hadn't touched me. Eventually I worked up the courage to leave the bathroom. He was there waiting for me, and then he started yelling at me for leading him on. He said I shouldn't have worn so much makeup and looked like that if I didn't want his attention. He followed me around calling me names like a tease, until I finally found an employee to help. The employee was probably just a poor teenager, but he actually helped me a lot. He asked the creep to stop following me and to go with him to speak with a manager. I wish I had stayed longer to speak with the manager too, but once the guy was out of my sight, I ran. I got the fuck out of there and I went back to my dorm where I locked myself in all night. Every time I see a man who looks like him, I have another panic attack because I think it's the same person and he might want to hurt me. This is the first time anybody has made me feel so scared. So let's not meet again. It was New Year's Eve and also my birthday, and myself and 2 of my friends were out the front of my house listening to music on my iPod. We were about 12 at the time and there was no one else around. It was probably around 10 or 10:30 at night and we were waiting for the illegal fireworks to light up down the street. It happened every year at this time. It probably sounds a little weird, 12-year-old kids by themselves at 10:30 p.m. listening to Katy Perry in the middle of the street, but it wasn't too unusual. See, my neighbourhood is very close-knit. We know all of our neighbours very well, so our parents who were in the house and ourselves weren't at all concerned. We were listening to Hot and Cold by Katy Perry and were jamming along to it when we began to hear a whistling sound. First off, it sounded like it was part of the song, so initially we ignored it, but that was until it started to distort and go out of rhythm to the music. It didn't seem to be in tune with the song and it was eerily out of pitch. I don't know why, maybe to hear it better, but my friend decided to pause the music. Maybe it was just in the song, or maybe the phone was glitching. As soon as the music stopped, the whistling continued, pitchy and slow. We were a little bit spooked. It was dark outside other than the few streetlights on the road, and we couldn't really see much or make much out of the darkness other than the strange whistling. We were able to pinpoint the direction it was coming from soon enough, though. We turned towards it and froze. About 10 meters from where we were standing, on the edge of the street lamp's light, was a man. He looked quite disheveled and was most likely homeless. He was just standing there looking at us, whistling that godforsaken pitchy whistle. We were all frozen for a while, as I guess we were caught off guard, until my fight or flight mode kicked in. I yelled at my friends to get inside, and they began screaming and ran up the driveway. I pushed and shoved them forward, terrified because I didn't know whether they could hear what I was hearing. The whistling had finally stopped, but something else was drowning out the silence. Heavy-set footsteps. He was chasing after us. I screamed bloody murder at them to open the front door and shoved them inside, not caring if I hurt them. I turned and slammed the deadbolt just as he reached the screen door. I watched as his figure came into view. He was dirty, wearing soiled, long-sleeved clothes, had an unkempt beard and wore a torn beanie. As I closed the door, he stopped just ahead of the screen, looked me dead in the eye, and murmured something that still makes my skin crawl. Damn it. One of my friends consoled the other, who was now in tears, as I watched this man through the peephole. He lingered for a second more, then disappeared into the blackness. I remember my friends grabbing me, asking if I was okay, and then pointing down to my hands. I was shaking like a leaf. We never told our parents. This was over 10 years ago, and it still gives me the heebie-jeebies to think what would have happened if we hadn't noticed the out-of-place whistling. Dishevelled old whistler, let's not meet. When my mother and grandmother were alive and I lived with them, we would rent a house and spend the summer vacations in a town 30 minutes away from the city where we lived. In this town, my mother had a friend who had a husband, we'll call him Jay, and a daughter, we'll call her Anne. Anne was a few years younger than me and was actually a rude little bitch. However, this story is about her father. Jay just gave off that creepy vibe from the moment I first met him. His daughter also seemed to hate him with a burning passion, which I found unusual for a child of her age, but she never told me why. She kept flipping him off whenever he would turn around, and she would talk shit about him. I asked her many times where the hatred came from, but she always just said that she just didn't like him. That never really sounded right to me, but I never knew anything about it. To this day, I theorize he was abusive at home. Not towards Anne, but towards his wife, my mum's friend. Anne just witnessed it and hated her father, but couldn't do much about it. Now, the story. It happened when I think I was 11 years old. My family used to throw small parties with a few friends some nights, and of course her friend, Jay, and Anne were there too. The adults were usually sitting at a big table, while a smaller one with small chairs was set apart for Anne and me, so we could play and eat something and not bother our parents. This one time we were just playing around as usual, and when I went to sit down, Anne moved my chair away. She usually pranked me around like that, but this time it resulted in me hitting my private parts on the edge of the chair. I screamed out because it hurt like hell, and I went crying to my mum. I was scared because it hurt a lot, so I insisted that my mum took me to my room and made sure everything was okay down there. Jay was there as well, so when I told my mum where I had hit myself, he heard me, and of course he wanted to take a look as well. He insisted in coming with my mum and I to see and make sure I was all right. My mum wasn't stupid, so she didn't allow him close. She always thought he was creepy as well. But that wasn't all. When my mum was with me in my room checking my privates really quick, Jay actually came into my room, insisting in that he was worried about me. Thank God my mum was done checking and she'd quickly kicked him out of the room. I was just creeped out about this man's insistence in seeing my privates. I avoid him even more from there on. After that happened, I just went back to play. This isn't the only short story we had about this guy though. Other similar incidents included him insisting on changing my sister's diaper. She's only 1 year younger than me, but still wears diapers to this day due to a mental disability that basically doesn't let her do anything. One early morning he walked into our house uninvited while we were having breakfast and still in our pajamas. I'm not sure if this story is enough for this subreddit, but in any case, to my friend's creepy father, let's not meet again. This is something that's stuck with me for the past 8 years. When I was 20, I was working in a local pizza place and doing volunteer work at my local library. My hometown is small enough that it classifies as a village, and at the time the crime rate was virtually non-existent. While putting in my hours at the library, I noticed a young man watching me. I'd place him at around 26. He started coming in nearly every day I was there and was clearly watching me as he would come into my section every time. Whether it was non-fiction, children's books or magazines, whatever. An image that sticks out in my mind is an extremely cartoonish one of him actually holding a magazine upside down, while in direct eyesight of myself, watching me over the top of it. In my early 20s I was very alternative, so I was not exactly unused to this type of attention, but I was, and still am, extremely wary of being flirted with in any way. He ultimately started striking up conversations with me. Did I go to school? Did I work anywhere? All the basic seemingly innocent but prying questions. Again, being privy to this type of interaction, I know I never gave him any solid answers. I maybe told him I worked in a pizza parlour. There are tons where I'm from, like most areas, and that I went to college in a nearby larger city. I left it at that on top of other small interactions over the course of a couple of weeks. The pizza parlour at which I worked was and still is a very small family-owned operation located within a shopping centre in what I guess would be called the downtown of my hometown. It's important to note that it stayed open later than the rest of the centre. At 9 p.m. everything else closed. Empty parking lots, lights off, the whole deal. The pizza shop stayed open till 10 p.m, so I'd be closing up and leaving around 10:30. Nightly we locked up the front door to dissuade any late-night customers. One night, however, I opened the door to sweep out a cockroach. I can't stand the crunch they make when you step on them, and didn't want to take it all the way out the back. And there he was. The guy from the library sitting on the ground outside the front door in the dark, closed shopping centre. He was holding a duffel bag. After all the interactions we'd had, I'd never even knew his name. I said, "Oh, hi, what are you doing here?" He went into a stuttering speech about he thought I'd said I'd worked at another pizza parlour in another nearby city, and that he had no idea I'd be here. How funny, haha. Again, this is a family-owned shop. There is no other one, and it had a very unique name. Even if I had mentioned the name, he'd have at least known it was the only one, and I'd know never to tell a stranger that was expressing any sort of interest in me where I worked. I still don't. I simply locked the door again, went back inside, and never mentioned it to my boss, though maybe I should have. There's a man sitting outside in the dark with a duffel bag who wanted to talk to me. Seems like a bigger deal now than I guess it did then. Luckily, I guess, he'd lost his nerve for whatever he wanted to do. He was gone by the time I'd left, and my mum was the one who picked me up, as I didn't drive. Sometimes it occurs to me that he could have been somewhere waiting for me to walk alone to my car, as he wouldn't have known I didn't drive. It still makes me feel creeped out to think about it. I wonder if he had followed me home, since I would leave directly from the library to go to work. I don't know. Even if he was confused and ended up outside my obviously closed place of work with a large bag in an otherwise clearly closed and dark shopping centre, I have never really been able to put together exactly what he could have been wanting from anyone there. That's enough to make me really genuinely hope we never meet again.